The studio lights dimmed for just a moment, and in that silence, something extraordinary was about to unfold. What started as Ellen's regular Tuesday taping would become the most beautiful love story ever told without a single spoken word. Jake Thompson sat in the third row, his hands trembling slightly as he watched Ellen work the crowd with her signature energy. The 23-year-old graphic designer from Portland had been planning this moment for 3 months, ever since he'd submitted his story to the show's producers. Next to him sat Sarah Chen, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She thought they were just attending Ellen's show together as friends, the way they'd done everything for the past 3 years. Ellen was in the middle of her opening monologue when her producer whispered something in her earpiece. She paused mid-sentence, scanning the audience until her eyes found Jake, who was now standing and signing something with visible nervousness. Hold on, Ellen said, walking toward the audience. I think someone has something to say. Jake's heart pounded as Ellen approached. He'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, but now, with cameras rolling and Sarah looking confused beside him, the words he'd never been able to speak felt heavier than ever. This is Jake, Ellen announced to the studio. And Jake, you wrote to me about something pretty special, didn't you? Jake nodded and began signing, his movements fluid despite his nerves. Ellen watched intently, trying to follow along, but her basic sign language skills quickly proved inadequate for what Jake was trying to communicate. Okay, I'm getting love and Sarah, Ellen said, squinting as she attempted to interpret. But you're going way too fast for me, buddy. The audience chuckled, but Jake's expression remained serious. He looked directly at Sarah, who was now realizing this moment was about her, and continued signing with an intensity that needed no translation. Ellen stopped trying to interpret and simply watched. In 40 years of television, she'd learned to recognize moments that transcended language, and this was one of them. Jake's signs became more emotional, more desperate. His eyes filled with tears as he poured 3 years of unspoken feelings into movements that Sarah couldn't understand but could feel. The studio fell silent. Even without comprehension, everyone could sense the weight of what was happening. Sarah reached out tentatively, touching Jake's hands to still them. I wish I understood, she whispered, her own eyes beginning to tear. That's when Ellen made a decision that would define the next 20 minutes of television. She walked to her desk, picked up her phone, and made a call right there on stage. I need an ASL interpreter at the Ellen Studios right now, she said into the phone. No, not tomorrow, right now. The audience erupted in applause, but Ellen wasn't done. She walked back to Jake and Sarah, who were now both crying for different reasons. Jake, Ellen said, looking directly at him, you've been carrying this for 3 years? Jake nodded, wiping his eyes. He signed something brief, and Ellen caught enough to understand. Every day. Sarah, Ellen turned to the confused young woman. Do you have any idea what he's been trying to tell you? Sarah shook her head, looking between Jake and Ellen. He's my best friend. We do everything together. But I never learned sign language, and he never. She trailed off as understanding began to dawn. The way Jake looked at her, the way he'd always been there, the way this moment felt like something much bigger than friendship. Within 10 minutes, a professional ASL interpreter named Michael arrived on set. Ellen introduced him to the audience and asked him to position himself where both Jake and Sarah could see him clearly. Jake, Ellen said softly. Tell her. Jake took a deep breath and began signing. This time, his movements were slower, more deliberate, carrying the weight of years of silence. Michael's voice filled the studio. Sarah, I need you to know that you changed my life the day we met in that coffee shop 3 years ago. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. The audience held its breath. Jake continued, and Michael translated. You learned 20 signs just to say good morning to me every day. And I fell in love with your determination before I fell in love with your smile. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she realized the magnitude of what she was hearing. Jake had been in love with her for 3 years, and she'd been completely unaware. I never told you because I was afraid, Michael continued as Jake signed. Afraid that you'd feel sorry for me, or that our friendship would change, or that you'd think loving someone who couldn't speak to you normally was too hard. Ellen was openly crying now, and the cameras captured every moment of this unprecedented declaration of love. Jake's signs became more passionate, but watching you laugh, watching you care about everyone around you, watching you try to include me in every conversation, even when it was difficult, I realized that not telling you was the real crime. Sarah stood up from her seat, moving closer to Jake. She'd never seen him so vulnerable, so open. I don't know sign language well enough to respond, Michael translated as Jake continued. But I know you well enough to hope that maybe, possibly, you might feel something too. The studio was completely silent, except for the sound of quiet crying from audience members who were witnessing something pure and real. Sarah looked at Jake, then at Michael, then back at Jake. She spoke directly to him, knowing he could read her lips. "Can you teach me how to say yes?" Jake's face transformed. Through his tears, he showed Sarah the simple sign for yes, a gesture that looked like a head nod made with a closed fist. Sarah copied the movement, and the studio erupted. But Ellen wasn't finished making this moment magical. Hold on, Ellen said, waving for quiet. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." Sarah looked at Ellen expectantly. "Jake didn't just want to tell you he loved you today. He wanted to ask you something else." Jake's eyes widened. This wasn't part of the plan they'd discussed with producers. Ellen was improvising, and he wasn't sure where this was going. Ellen reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. "He asked me to keep this safe until the right moment." Jake's mouth fell open. He started signing frantically, clearly confused. Michael translated, "That's not mine. I don't understand." Ellen smiled that mischievous smile. Her audience knew well. "It's not yours yet, but I called a friend of mine who owns a jewelry store, and I told him about your story." She handed the box to Jake. "He said any man brave enough to declare his love in sign language on national television deserves a ring worthy of the moment." The audience was on its feet now. Sarah was crying so hard she could barely see. Jake opened the box with shaking hands to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "Sarah," Ellen said, "I think Jake has one more thing to ask you." Jake looked at the ring, then at Sarah, then at Ellen. He was completely overwhelmed, but Ellen nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Jake got down on one knee right there in the aisle of Ellen's studio. He looked up at Sarah and began signing. Michael's voice shook as he translated, "Sarah Chen, will you marry me and spend the rest of your life learning my language while I spend the rest of mine learning to speak yours?" Sarah didn't need to learn the sign for her answer. She fell to her knees in front of Jake and kissed him, which needed no translation at all. The studio exploded in cheers. Ellen was sobbing openly. Even the camera operators were wiping their eyes as they captured the most spontaneous proposal in television history. When Sarah and Jake finally broke apart, Sarah took his hands and signed the only phrase she knew fluently, the one she'd learned 3 years ago to greet him every morning, "Good morning, beautiful." Jake laughed through his tears and signed back, "Good morning, forever." Ellen helped them both to their feet and brought them onto the main stage. "I think we need to make this official," she said. She called Michael over as well. "Jake, I want you to know something. This show has featured a lot of love stories, but I've never seen anything like what just happened." Jake signed something, and Michael translated. He says thank you for giving him the courage to finally tell the truth. "But you gave yourself the courage," Ellen replied. "I just provided the interpreter." Ellen turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just witnessed something that proves love truly is a universal language." She reached into her desk again. "But I'm not done surprising you two." Ellen pulled out 2 thick envelopes. "Jake, you told our producers that you and Sarah have been saving up for a wedding for 2 years, not knowing if you'd ever get the chance to use that money." Sarah looked confused, not knowing about Jake's secret hopes. Jake blushed deeply. "Well, these are vouchers for a complete wedding package," Ellen announced. "Venue, flowers, catering, photography, and," she paused for dramatic effect, "a honeymoon in Paris, where the language of love needs no words." The audience erupted again. Sarah and Jake held each other, overwhelmed by the generosity and the magnitude of how their lives had just changed. "There's one more thing," Ellen said. "Jake, you work as a graphic designer, and Sarah, you're a teacher, right?" They both nodded. Well, I happen to know a school for the deaf that's been looking for a graphic designer to help with their communications, and they need teachers who understand both hearing and deaf communities. Ellen handed them another envelope. Consider this your joint job interview, if you're interested. Jake signed something elaborate, and Michael translated. He says this doesn't feel real. He says 3 hours ago he was just a man who was afraid to tell a woman he loved her, and now you're a man who's about to marry his best friend. Ellen finished. That's what happens when you find the courage to speak your truth in whatever language comes naturally to you. Sarah had been mostly silent, overwhelmed by everything happening. Now she asked Michael to translate something for her. I want Jake to know, she said, looking directly at him, that I've been falling in love with him too, but I thought he only saw me as a friend. I've been trying to learn more sign language in secret because I wanted to surprise him. Jake's eyes widened as Michael translated. Sarah continued, I bought books. I've been watching videos. I wanted to be able to have real conversations with him. She pulled out her phone and showed Jake something. I've been practicing this for 2 months. Sarah began signing slowly and carefully. You are the kindest man I know, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to tell me. Jake started crying all over again. He signed back. You never needed to be sorry. You loved me the best way you knew how. Ellen watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone who just witnessed a miracle. I think, she said, we've just learned something about communication that goes way beyond language. She addressed the audience directly. Jake and Sarah taught us that love doesn't require perfect communication. It requires perfect intention. As the show wrapped up, Ellen made one final gesture. She brought out a professional photographer who had been capturing the entire proposal. These photos, Ellen said, are going to be the first pictures in your wedding album. But more importantly, they're proof that the most beautiful conversations happen when people are brave enough to speak from their hearts. Jake and Sarah left the studio that day with more than just an engagement. They left with a love story that had touched millions of people, and a reminder that courage comes in many forms. 6 months later, they returned to Ellen's show for a follow-up. Sarah had become fluent in sign language, and Jake had started taking speech therapy to improve his vocal communication. The most amazing thing, Sarah told Ellen during their return visit, is that learning his language didn't just help us communicate better. It helped me understand how much more there is to communication than just words. Jake signed his agreement, and this time Sarah translated for the audience. He says that love taught us both new languages. I learned signs, he learned to trust his voice, and together we learned that understanding someone completely is the most beautiful gift you can give or receive. Ellen's final words that day became the motto for their wedding invitations. Love is fluent in every language, but it speaks loudest in courage. The ring from Ellen's friend became a family heirloom. The photos from the proposal hang in their home, and every morning Sarah still greets Jake with the same sign she learned 3 years ago. Good morning, beautiful. Because some languages, once learned, are never forgotten. But the story didn't end with their wedding, or even their successful careers at the California School for the Deaf. 3 years after that magical day on Ellen's show, Jake and Sarah received a letter that would change their perspective on everything that had happened. It was from a young girl named Emma, who had been watching Ellen's reruns with her deaf parents, and had learned sign language specifically because of Jake and Sarah's story. Emma's letter, written in careful handwriting, explained that she had been bullied at school for having deaf parents, feeling ashamed and isolated until she saw their love story. You showed me that sign language isn't something to hide, she wrote. It's something beautiful that connects hearts. Jake and Sarah realized that their moment of vulnerability had rippled out into the world, touching lives they'd never know about, giving courage to families they'd never meet. When Ellen invited them back for their 3rd anniversary show, she had one final surprise. The studio audience was filled entirely with deaf and hard of hearing individuals and their families, people whose lives had been touched by Jake and Sarah's story. As the couple walked onto the stage, hundreds of hands moved in perfect synchronization, signing "thank you" in a visual symphony that needed no sound to be perfectly understood. Ellen's closing words that day captured the true magic of what had unfolded. 3 years ago, we thought we were witnessing a love story, but what we really saw was the birth of a movement, proof that when you speak your truth, no matter what language you use, the whole world learns to listen. And in that moment, as Jake and Sarah stood surrounded by a sea of moving hands celebrating their courage, they understood that some stories never really end. They just keep teaching the world how to love better.